Okay, today I'm going to try to riff on three subjects, those being the finale or the, you know, summation of the Math is Therapy series of videos, namely regarding the concept of paraconsistency, which everything in the previous videos has been setting up as a concept. And then I'd like to talk about my personal interpretation of the Anishinaabe Seven Fires prophecy or prophecies. It's just my interpretation. You shouldn't be learning about the Seven Fires prophecies themselves from me. Just go to Anishinaabe source material for that. This is just my personal thoughts on it. And then I'd like to end with a comment about Afro-Pessimism and the so-called Dark Enlightenment philosophers, and that seemingly they are very distinct from each other or even ideologically opposed to each other, but I'm convinced that they're speaking to the same underlying idea. And we'll get to that. So anyway, first up, paraconsistency. Usually paraconsistency is assumed to mean basically artificially tolerating contradictory statements, or statements that are intuitively seemingly contradictory. A paraconsistent system, though, will allow for limited contradictions. So it'll allow for some well-defined discriminating principle by which you limit but acknowledge contradiction at the same time. In doing this, the assumption is that you stall or avoid the so-called principle of explosion in classical or traditional logic. That principle assumes that if you accept even one contradictory statement into your logical system, your system explodes into trivial nonsense, because from that you can prove within that system of logic anything. That's the idea. But I think it's very easy to demonstrate that paraconsistency is actually provably consistent with any other consistent form of reasoning, whether it's piano or arithmetic or, predicate calculus or whatever. You don't need, in other words, to artificially stall the principle of explosion. You don't need to artificially tolerate or discriminate between contradictory statements. Rather, I think it can be demonstrated easily that you just need a geometric model or a topological model of whatever system you're talking about, which is itself consistent, but is accommodating for extensions, basically paraconsistent extensions to, business as usual. In other words, logic as we know it, like classical traditional logic. The easiest way to demonstrate this, I think, is if you imagine a one-dimensional real number line, an object that we're all generally familiar with. You have 0 in the middle. To the right side, you have the positive real numbers. To the left side, you have the negative real numbers. Now imagine that we split that line into two around the 0 point, so that you have, in a two-dimensional space, two separate lines. Both of them begin with 0. One of them is the negative real numbers, and the other is the positive real numbers. Now imagine that they are out of alignment with each other. There's an offset between the vertical alignment of the 0 point of, say, the positive real number line and the, and some other number along the negative real line, some other number other than 0. If you define opposition to mean both the definition according to the additive identity, namely, the opposite of any number is that which sums to 0, right? So the opposite of positive 2 is negative 2, because 2 minus 2 is 0. You have the additive identity. You have that definition of opposition. However, you also have, potentially, let's say, the definition of opposition, which is vertical alignment, right? Because if the two lines were aligned with each other, that would also be implied. In other words, as you went if you moved from the 0 point on the positive real number line to the number 1, that number 1 would be directly above -1, right? So if you offset the lines from each other and you have this definition of opposition built into your system, you've just introduced paraconsistency. You've introduced identities, equivalences, in addition to the normal non-contradictory identities of, say, Peano arithmetic, like second-order Peano arithmetic or Zermelo-Frankel choice set theory. So you've introduced paraconsistency, but it doesn't explode. At least it doesn't explode unless you're infinitesimally offset from 0. At which point everything equals everything, right? There is potential for an explosion, but it doesn't necessarily explode, right? If you have it offset by +1, let's say, the numbered lines are offset from each other by +1, then all of the multiples of 1 will be equivalent to each other on either line. But it's not the case that any number is equivalent to any other number or certain other contradictory statements. In other words, you don't have to artificially limit the tolerance of these contradictory statements. It's already built in, right? And I think that we know that reasoning in the human mind already works this way because we already know that we are subject to cognitive bias. We have inadequate reasoning mechanisms. No matter how intelligent a human is, they're ultimately committing mistakes in their reasoning, inevitably, at some level. Knowing that, we also immediately know that the brain doesn't literally explode, right? Like, reasoning doesn't just break down because we make a mistake. Rather, we assume that we haven't made a mistake and continue reasoning, right? We reason under false assumptions, and we make incorrect decisions under uncertainty. However, the underlying system of the brain itself continues to function without explosive contradictoriness, right? It doesn't literally break down, which means there's a deeper underlying consistency to the system that's allowing for this apparently contradictory, but actually on a deeper level, non-contradictory system, which is human reasoning, right? So we can also, I should add, define paraconsistency with an intersection of those two real number lines in addition to the offset. So you could have it offset by any value. You could also have any number, like infinitely many intersections between the points, or between the lines. And the lines can be shaped like any curve. They could be curved along any surface. They can be however many dimensions, right? So there's infinitely many ways to model paraconsistent systems in a way that is consistent, that's geometrically consistent, and that doesn't involve a logical explosion. So why does this matter? Well, there's a crucial distinction between when you confront a contradiction in any context, like in any aspect of conscious life, when you encounter a contradictory statement or set of information or whatever, a data set. When you encounter a contradiction, you have the option of either assuming that it's an illusion and it's just bad data and you should ignore it, right? It's not admitted into your system of reasoning. Or you have to question whether there's a deeper underlying system, a basis, according to which this apparent contradiction is actually consistent, right? That's much more important, really, discovering that second phenomenon. In the history of physics in particular, you have these, with general relativity and quantum mechanics perhaps especially, you have these seemingly counterintuitive, contradictory ideas, whether it's, the non-intuitive aspect of relativity itself, or more significantly, more obviously, all of the paradoxical aspects of quantum mechanics that make mathematical sense. They are mathematically consistent, but they're seemingly contradictory. Things like superposition or quantum entanglement or quantum indeterminacy, and even the presence of complex numbers and even potentially infinitely many hyper-complex number systems that could be necessary to describe particle physics, as we know it. Quaternions, octonians, Sidonians, Trigintaduonians, and so forth, potentially. I mean, who knows? The point is that, we, like in the case of Einstein's suspicions regarding quantum mechanics, he assumed something was contradictory based on an intuitive reasoning and an assumption of consistency in reasoning as it pertains to reality. But ultimately, quantum mechanics was proven to be what it appears to be, right? Like the seemingly contradictory aspects are not actually contradictory. There's a deeper underlying consistency that allows for these things. So in general, I think this is a psychological, existential issue that we have as human beings, where we are ourselves contradictory in our own reasoning. We encounter existential contradiction in our waking existence. We're programmed to survive, even though we're inevitably going to die. That's probably the most fundamental one. But also we're programmed to be goal-oriented creatures in an existence that we can tell logically is without an actual goal, right? There is no teleological purpose to our existence, and yet we're programmed to live according to that purpose, according to, the obtainment of goals. Anyway, if we remain in a position of, or in a state of cognitive dissonance with regards to these seemingly contradictory aspects of our own existence, it causes suffering, right? This is not news. This is essentially what Buddhism and Gnostic Christianity and Jainism and everything else, and my own philosophical attitude that I refer to as radical depressive realism. All of these intuitive techniques, these systems of cognitive reframing, basically, they all are acknowledging the fact that what appears to be contradictory in conscious waking life is actually illusory at some level, and that there is a deeper consistency according to which you can not suffer so badly. Basically, if you reframe your cognition, your cognitive mode to be focused on this deeper underlying consistency, there's less cognitive suffering involved, right? So it's an important thing to acknowledge, not only in a Zen koan, sort of poetic context, but in a mathematical, philosophical context, basically, is my point. Okay, so moving on, I'd like to give my take of the Seven Fires prophecy of the Anishinaabe peoples. The Anishinaabe generally refers to, in my area of the Great Lakes region, of Michigan, it generally refers to the Council of the Three Fires tribes, namely the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. But Anishinaabe also can refer to the Algonquin, Mississauga, and Nipissing tribes that are more northern Canadian tribes, I guess. And they all extend from the Wabanaki Confederacy. It's they're the more eastern, northern history. It's very complex, but basically, I think the Seven Fires prophecy is the most sane wisdom tradition that I'm aware of. It's focused on essentially trauma and healing. It's a story of trauma and healing in a fractal form, meaning at every level it's the same idea. At the individual spiritual level, at the tribal communal spiritual level, at the ethnic level, as you extend beyond the tribe that you're born into and into a broader family. Basically, the story of the Seven Fires prophecy is one of family estrangement and family reunion. So trauma and reconciliation, injury and healing. And in particular, I think it's the most relevant wisdom mode to be in the present as we face impending extinction as a human species. What are our options to actually optimize our extinction to whatever extent that's even possible at this point in history. So the Anishinaabe tradition, I think, lays out exactly how it would be possible to improve our lot in life as human beings, basically, while we still have time. So anyway, I'll just go in order with the prophecies. The first prophecy supposedly was delivered to all the Algonquin nations in the Wabanaki family. So the Wabanaki Confederacy consists of 5 subgroups. I don't know if they're families of tribes themselves. So the 5 are Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Wolastoqiyik, and the Western Abenaki. So and those 5 groups are represented on the totem symbolically in the Wabanaki tradition, I guess, as eagle, bear, otter, turtle, pine tree, those 5 levels. So the first prophecy concerns the fundamental spiritual tradition of the Anishinaabe, which is the Midewiwin religious spiritual tradition. It means way of the heart. So the Midewiwin Lodge, which is shaped like a shell, the first prophecy concerns the central significance of that lodge, which is to say of healing, communal healing, where you gather and work through spiritually your pain, your suffering together as a community and as a family. That's the central idea of the culture, is the way of the heart. The lodge symbolically represents the Meegis shell, or the cowrie shells. These are sea snails of different sizes. They represent the fundamental Manaduag, I guess it'd be a spiritual divine patron or a guide from the spirit realm, if you will, or like in the Anishinaabe view, spiritual truth or revelation, teaching can manifest in any form, especially in the form of animals and other human beings. So the sea snails represent these ancient guides. They also indicate, when they're on the shoreline of an island, a healthy ecosystem at some level. So that's the fundamental aspect of the prophecy, is to just establish the central significance of the Midewiwin Lodge and that spiritual tradition, that way of seeing the world. The next aspect of the prophecy is that there will be 7 periods or 7 stops along this spiritual path. That's the 7 fires. And the fundamental idea here of the spiritual system is that it's already setting up the distinction between a spiritual path and the materialist path. That's one way to put it. But really, what does that mean? Well, it's the difference between like wisdom and foolishness, compassion and hatred, sanity and madness, realism and delusion, or delusional fantasy. So the spirituality is a science of love. It's a system, a rational system of love, compassion, communal peace, healing. Whereas the technocratic aspect of materialism it has to do with the science of power, just how to achieve power. So the ultimate endpoints of those paths are, horror, like a horrifying form of extinction when it comes to materialistic technocracy, the science of power, versus peace, just a more peaceful form of death at the individual level, at the communal level, and ultimately at the species level. That's the choice that's being presented throughout human history. That's the idea of this tradition, as I see it. So the cowrie shells, the sea snails, they've also historically represented money in other systems, but not in this one. That's important. They represent the spiritual path, not just a shiny shell that you can use as currency. Rather, they represent a contemplative relationship with your environment, having a peaceful, healthy relationship with nature, basically. So the prophecy also sets up the idea of the tribe moving along 7 periods on this path, along 7 stops, and in the process discovering what are called turtle-shaped islands that are marked with the Meiji shells. Oh, there's a sandhill crane. Anyway, so the Anishinaabe term for the world, or is that a turkey? It's interesting. Maybe it's a turkey. The Anishinaabe term for the world is Turtle Island. It's the same term for North America, or basically the cosmos itself. It's a fractal idea. So Turtle Island, as a concept, can refer to the cosmos, as well as your immediate environment as the tribe. It's a fractal notion. It also represents the purification of the earth in general. So the prophecy involved the Anishinaabe discovering the first two such islands, turtle-shaped islands marked by the shells. That was at Mo'onayaang, which is Montreal, and then Niagara Falls, which is Wayaanagakaabik-awang. Anishinaabe is hard. It's rough pronouncing it. So it's just setting up the overall path. Where is this bird? I don't know if there's a more interesting bird. So the I can't see it. Anyway, so the second prophecy involves the third and fourth. I'm realizing this is going to go on longer than I picture. I'm going to summarize here. The overall, so it tells this. These prophecies tell the story of the Anishinaabe people themselves being separated from each other. So they split into a north and a south group, and the southern group ends up splitting further as they pass Wawiatanong, as they would call it, which is Detroit, and the Wawiataan, which is Lake St. Clair, the Round Lake. That particular region, which is where I live, was where the southern group of the Anishinaabe fractured, and they lost their way spiritually and geographically. So there was this process of them returning to the Detroit, Lake St. Clair area, the Wawiataan area, and going further north and re-encountering the Ottawa, re-encountering the Mississauga, and the Ottawa of the southern group initiated a healing process, a reconciliatory process with the northern tribes, and they were regrouped and they rediscovered their spiritual path, and they had a healing event. Then the next big rupture is the arrival of white people, basically white merchants. The French arrived first, then the British, then the Virginians or the Americans, and it's prophesied that the white people will have to make a choice, basically, as to their attitude toward the Anishinaabe. Are they going to come with peace, or are they going to come with hatred? And history has suggested that it was both, but hatred was the more dominant ideology by far. There were examples certainly of peaceful relationships, but on the whole, there was a genocidal, hateful attitude towards the Anishinaabe, and in particular, the Medebwin religion or spiritual path, in contrast to Orthodox Christianity, whether it was Catholicism or Calvinist, Presbyterian, Protestantism, or whatever. Anyway, so that's another traumatic rupture, and then that gets worse, and it gets so bad that the indigenous people themselves again start to lose their way because they're being tempted now to conform to the materialist, technocratic, mercantilist, capitalist, however you want to describe it, really. It's basically just power-driven, the power-based ideology of the white people, basically. And in doing so, the Anishinaabe lose, again, their spiritual traditions, they lose their culture, their language to an extent. That's another traumatic rupture. And then the question is, first the Anishinaabe have to recover their own spiritual identity. Then the white people, basically, have to make a decision again. Are they going to just continue on this path, which will lead to the total extinction, not only of the human race, but of life on Earth? Or are they going to wake up spiritually and then seek the Anishinaabe finally, not do what historically has been done, which is assume a position of superiority over the Anishinaabe? No, do the exact opposite, which is approach the Anishinaabe elders with humility and seek guidance, in the 11th hour, basically, of, our chance to survive on the planet at all, or to die with dignity, basically. Are we going to do that or not? That's the big question. And the idea is that if we, it's a choice between extinction or learning from the Anishinaabe, basically. And the prophecy says, the seventh prophecy says very interestingly that a new people will arise to seek guidance from the elders. So not just the traditional Anishinaabe. The implication is the new people will be a composite group, not only of white people, but of, all forms of people, basically. Part of the earlier prophecy is to identify the fake promise, what I would refer to as fake Jesus. The Christians, the Christian missionaries, were largely responsible for a lot of the genocidal actions taken against indigenous people in general in North America and South America. But in particular, it was this attitude of spiritual superiority that was the fundamental flaw, obviously, in this hateful system of Orthodox Christianity that was trying to suppress the Medebwin spiritual path, the way of the heart. There was a debate between the Anishinaabe Ojibwe chief, Chief Oshawana, on Bikejwanong, or Walpole Island, on July 31st, 1844. There was a debate between him and the Anishinaabe Council and the Jesuit missionaries who were trying to occupy the island. And it was a fascinating debate where the fundamental spiritual distinction, the philosophical distinction between the Anishinaabe way of life and way of seeing reality, and the delusional, hateful, stupidity of the Jesuit mentality. And by contrast, it's made very clear. What I might take away from this is basically that the Anishinaabe people appeared to me to be the sanest group of people on Earth. And in the 11th hour of human existence on this planet, the idea of more and more people, especially white people, but ultimately every group of people on Earth, more and more people taking guidance specifically from the Anishinaabe elders is, I think, the way to go. That's the best option that we have. I don't have much more to say about it. So moving on to the final point, Afro-Pessimism and Dark Enlightenment, these two philosophical 21st century movements. The idea of Afro-Pessimism is essentially to dispel the delusional notion that there's some reconciliatory strategy to pursue for Black Americans in particular, to live peacefully within the white system, if you will, or like the society in the United States of America such as we know it today, that there's any internally consistent way to solve the fundamental racist attitude toward Black Americans in this system. The Afro-Pessimism says no, that's just not possible. That's the pessimistic aspect. It's like there is no hope from this. We have to, if anything, just go 180 degrees away from this way of thinking and way of government and way of just cultural identity, even, and ideological, thinking. It's just, it's a path of destruction and death, basically. So don't go down it at all. That's the fundamental point of Afro-Pessimism. With Dark Enlightenment, which ironically is associated with like white racist ideology. But what is the point of Dark Enlightenment? The idea is that the Enlightenment in history, in philosophical, scientific history, the Enlightenment represented not only a seemingly positive movement away from religious delusion or authoritarian irrationality in the form of religious structures that are synonymous with the state and so forth. It also represented the beginning of using science to solve questions of power rather than a rational use of force alone. In other words, it initiated the age of more and more efficient forms of slavery and exploitation and manipulation and the achievement of power by one group or one individual against others, right? That the Enlightenment was the real takeoff point for streamlining slavery, essentially. And thus, the Enlightenment is not necessarily good, right? And I think there's copious amounts of evidence for this in the form, in particular, of so-called technological innovation that has led to environmental catastrophe and also ticks. Shit. Getting eaten by ticks. Environmental catastrophe, automation that devalues the human subject in a limitless way, meaning it ultimately devalues human subjectivity itself. We're already seeing this occur on a daily basis with contemporary so-called artificial intelligence. Really, it's just machine learning, like automated machine learning that has the fundamental problem of at once being very capable of imitating human behavior successfully or accurately, passing Turing tests, in other words, but also being beyond the scope of human control. I mean, that's just, it's the same problem as the nuclear bomb, except it's worse because it applies to every system that is now dependent on, information through the internet, through, like digital communication, which is everything. So it is a catastrophe. It's a disaster. So like both the underlying idea of the Dark Enlightenment and the underlying idea of Afro-Pessimism are true. As far as I can see, these are both very agreeable perspectives. I tend to be an existential pessimist, so of course any example of like convincing, well-grounded pessimism is going to be agreeable to me at some level. But the point is, though, from a radical depressive realist standpoint, that the futility witnessed accurately by these forms of existential pessimism leads us to the question of, okay, what do you do to optimize, though, in this situation? Like, bad as things may be, how do we prevent them from being the worst they can possibly be? And that leads us to the Anishinaabe way of life, I think. So, like, this whole process of a new people awakening that's discussed in the Seven Fires prophecy, I think it will take the form not just of people like miraculously and magically, having a dream that tells them what they need to do and so forth, but rather through rigorous logical reasoning, in mathematical philosophy or economics philosophy, intersectional theory. So-called intersectional theory, I believe, ultimately leads us to Madewabin, the way of the heart, basically. And there's a lot I could say about that, but anyway, I think that'll do it. Those are the three topics I wanted to discuss. I'm hoping, I'll just end by saying, I'm hoping to meet and ideally befriend and ideally form a trust-based relationship with Anishinaabe people on Bikajwanang, which is just a few miles away from where I live. I'd like to learn as much as I can from the culture, not just due to intellectual curiosity, but with a passionate urgency regarding the guidance that I think I and everyone on Earth needs from the people who are the most wise, the most sane, and the most successful at winning the kinds of victories that we need to win, with the use not of force, but of wisdom, like just clear-headed reasoning and patience and like emotional maturity and discipline and communal restorative justice practices, basically, like living in a way that's communally just and peace-oriented and fundamentally compassionate. yeah, the Anishinaabe model this more than any other group of people that I'm aware of. And I hope that it's not too late, basically, that we're not just going to go extinct, and there's, and this prophecy is basically just referring to the possibility of doing better than the worst possible outcome, but, in reality, it could be impossible still. Or it could just be something that won't happen. And spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, we have to deal with that as well, which is why radical depressive realism, I think, is ultimately still relevant, even though the Medewin path is so self-sufficient in itself, as I see it. Just like Jainism is a sufficient spiritual, philosophical path, it just doesn't, in and of itself, address the internal problems of